zone, perhaps good morning in another time zone, maybe even good evening somewhere else. Isn't that the amazing thing about this online kind of event these days? You never quite know what time of day it is when the audience is there, quite unlike any previous experience. Still, there we are. I'm speaking to you from my home in Wales, and it's a lovely day here today, and I hope it is where you are too. And we're going to talk about English as a global language, and in particular this rather intriguing title, The Future of Englishes. And I'll talk about Englishes in its plural form in just a moment. But you know, when you start talking about the future of a language, or future of anything really, as the philosophers say, it's always wise to have a brief look at the present and the past, because that's where the future is going to evolve from. And so as far as the present goes, the interesting question, I think, for me, and probably for you too, because I'm sure you must be asked it repeatedly, is, well, just how global is English these days? Is it still growing as a global language, as an international lingua franca, as it has been? Are there signs of its decline? What's the future going to be there? And of course, it's very difficult to answer such questions scientifically because, well, people don't keep statistics on these things. You know, you go to the census forms of the world and ask, are they asking questions about language on those forms? How many languages are in your country? How many people speak these different languages? And hardly any countries can collect that kind of information. And the same point applies then when you're talking about an additional language, a second language, a lingua franca kind of language, even less information there. So one does one's best, and one goes to the sources of potential information, the information about people learning English in schools or in higher education, organizations like the British Council, which was mentioned a little while ago, number of people taking exams in English, and all of that sort of thing. And just asking people on the street. I might ask you, you know, how many people do you think can handle English in Poland? And you'll say, I don't know, but you'll make a guess. And if you ask enough people, a kind of figure will emerge that will get a kind of consensus of agreement. And this is the sort of thing that one does when one tries to reach a total for the number of speakers of English as a global language. It's what I've done several times over the past, well, actually, for me too, almost 30 years of studying this particular subject. My book, English as a Global Language, came out not long after Poland had its first IATEFL conference. And soon after that, I did the first edition of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English language. And for that, I made a survey using the kind of sources that I just told you about. And went through every country in the world and basically asked the question, how many of you now listen, speak, read, write English? I mean, as we all know, the answers are going to be different depending upon which of those four mediums of expression you focus on. But speaking in a kind of general domestic sort of way, using English for everyday purposes, how many? And I reached a total for this is 1997, and I reached a total of 1.5 billion, 1,500 million people who seem to be using English around the world in almost every country at that time. The interesting thing was, of course, that of that 1.5 billion, only about 400 million were native speakers of English, that is, mother tongue speakers of English, or father tongue, depending upon your view of gender here, parent tongue, shall we say, to avoid the issue. Only 400. So for every one mother tongue speaker, there were, well, you know, 4, 16, roughly 4 non-native speakers of English. So the center of gravity of the language had already started to shift from the native speaker to the non-native speaker. Now, fast forward 8 years, because the second edition of my Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language came out in 2003. So I did the same exercise all over again. And this time, the figure that came out was 2 billion, 2,000 million. And incidentally, other people who were studying the same phenomenon at the time, people like David Graddol and Tom MacArthur, also came out with a similar figure. So 2,000 million. The number of native speakers didn't seem to have grown much. It's all the second language learners that were causing the increase. So notice now, for every 1 native speaker, there are now 5 non-native speakers using English somewhere in the world. And then the interesting point, I did the 3rd edition of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language just a couple of years ago. Came out at the end of 2018, and I did the same sort of exercise again. And every country in the world now is part of the focus, of course. And what figure did I get? And I got 2.3 billion. 2.3, up just 300 million from 2003. Now, this is interesting because, first of all, it shows that English is continuing to increase its reach as a global language, but not as fast as it used to. Because you see, from 1997 to 2003, well, that was what, 6 years, and we get 500 million increase. From 2003 to 2018, if the same rate of increase had carried on, we would now be talking about 3 billion speakers around the world, and we're not. We're talking about 2.3. So it does rather look as if the rate of increase of people learning English has sort of flattened out a little. It's still growing, but not as fast as previously. And you can spend quite a lot of time speculating about why this might be. Maybe it's because there is a kind of natural limit to the number of people in the world who need a lingua franca of that kind. I mean, does everybody need a lingua franca? Well, no. I mean, there must be millions and millions who are perfectly happy using their own language and never find the need or the opportunity or the desire to do anything with another language. I suspect that that figure will continue to grow, even at a lower rate, because as the world becomes a smaller place and as opportunities through the use of an international language become more evident to people, I suspect more and more people will continue to want to go and learn, in this case, English as a global language. Could there be other languages that could take over the role of English? This is a question that's often asked, isn't it? What is the future of English in the long term? And the answer is, well, of course, we've no idea. Always a danger trying to predict the future when it comes to language. I mean, imagine 1,000 years ago, when virtually everybody who was educated spoke Latin. If you'd said to them then, in 1,000 years' time, nobody will be speaking Latin anymore, apart from a few people in certain circumstances, they would have laughed you to shame and said, don't be ridiculous. And the same point applies to English. In 1,000 years' time, will we all be speaking English? Well, who knows? Who knows? If they land, maybe we'll all be speaking Martian or some other alien language. And of course, the point is, you see, that they will only land if they want to take over. And it's the taking over that is the critical factor when it comes to people wanting to learn another language. Because the reasons for a language becoming a global language, and this is the other question one so often gets asked, why has English become a global language? Why does any language become an international language? And the answer, of course, is all to do with the power of the people who speak it. It's nothing to do with the structure of the language or its vocabulary range or anything like that. No, it's all to do with power, isn't it? And this point has been well discussed now over the last 20 or so years, with varying points of view, but essentially we're talking about the original military power, political power of the British Empire, which brought the language around the world so much in the 1600s and 1700s. And then we're talking about the power of science and technology, the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s, which was to a very large extent mediated through the English language, which made English the language of science and technology, as it still very largely is. And then economic power in the 19th century with the growth of the international monetary system, the two most productive nations in the world, Britain at the beginning of the 1800s and America at the end of the 1800s. And then in the 20th century, of course, cultural power, the power that most young people encounter English in, with the internet and popular music and films and television and so on and so forth. All these different kinds of power at different times and in different ways have fostered the growth of English as a global language. So will it continue in that way? Well, it all depends on which other political, military, religious, possibly, cultural and other types of power come into being. If the main countries that have fostered the development of English for some reason fall away in their international power, then they will be replaced by somebody else, and their language will become a language of desire, and the figures will alter radically as a result. There are other reasons as well, of course. The growth of technology, the medium of automatic or online translation may be a factor in reducing the number of people who are wanting to learn another language in order to communicate with the rest of the world. If I can get into Google now and put Google Translate in and now get my meaning across without having to learn another language, then for many people that's enough for their everyday purposes. It's not enough if you want to have a really precise understanding of the language, of course. For that, you need human translators. They will never be replaced. As one knows, if one ever does any back translation from one of the online mediums and sees the lack of idiom, the occasional infelicity, the ambiguity, and so on that is always present. Yes, things may improve in decades hence, in centuries hence, but at the moment there's no likelihood of this being a major factor in flattening out the curve of international users of English. So we're at a stage now where with 2.3 billion, we've got one native speaker for now, well, nearly 6 non-native speakers. And quite clearly, the center of gravity of the language has shifted from the mother tongue speaker to the second language speaker. In other words, in answer to the question, who owns English? The answer is you do. All you good people in Poland and all the other countries that are the chat tells me you've have joined in today. Anybody who takes the trouble to learn a language to a fluent level has rights in it. Ownership is now no longer the province of those who initiated the language. Once upon a time, one could have said with some justification that the British owned English, and then later the Americans owned English. Well, you know, with 60-odd million people in Britain, we are a tiny, 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 tiny minority as far as world English is concerned. And even America, with its over 200 million speakers of English, even that is now a drop in the linguistic ocean. And so we're talking now about a language that has ceased to be owned by one and has come to be owned by many. And the result of that is immediately obvious in the way in which global English now has developed around the world into what? Well, as you well know, in any country that's watching this right now, as soon as a language starts to go around a country, it develops dialects. it develops new accents and new dialects. This has always been the case. There is no country in the world, no language in the world which lacks dialects and accents. The notion of a homogeneous, pure language, which is used in exactly the same way by everybody, is a myth. And therefore, you'd expect the same thing to happen as English broadens its reach. And that's what has happened. Just as English developed hundreds of dialects and accents within a country, so as it went to different countries, it developed new dialects and accents there. The principle is clear. As soon as a country adopts English as its lingua franca, as a second language, as an official language, or as a semi-official language, or gives it some sort of special status, or whatever it is, it will adapt it. Adoption leads to adaptation, or adaptation, I suppose one should say. And that is what's led to the international varieties of English that one encounters around the world. The new Englishes, as they're called. New in the sense that, as opposed to the old, what do I mean by that? Well, the old Englishes are, of course, the earliest varieties of English as it traveled around the globe. Irish English going back to the Middle Ages, Scottish English going up north from England, but then predominantly, of course, American English as it went across the ocean. And notice the point that it doesn't take long for a new variety of English to develop. People sometimes ask, how long does it take for a new English, for a new variety of English to grow? Is it years? Is it decades? Is it centuries? No. Is it weeks? Yes, yes. It only takes a few weeks for a new variety of English to manifest itself. I mean, the evidence is clear in the development of American English. You know, the first permanent settlers arrived in what is now the United States in the early 1600s, 1606, and settled in Virginia. And within weeks, the letters home from those new settlers gave evidence of what would one day become American English. It was already growing there as people encountered the local fauna and flora of the community, encountered the Indian tribes and learnt about the things that impressed them, and they would tell people at home about it. You know, words like wigwam and squaw and moccasin and the animals like skunk. All of these words suddenly started to come into letters. Now, in Britain, it's a completely new world, this world. And it was in the vocabulary mainly that this world manifested itself. And it only took a few weeks for this to happen. And exactly the same thing happened in the newer era of English globalization. Now, when was that? Well, it's basically after the Second World War, isn't it? The United Nations is established, an organization where people need to talk to each other. So lingua francas are absolutely essential, and so there are half a dozen official languages of the UN. But English was always the main working language of the organization in the corridors of power. And so from the 1960s onwards, we get all the newly independent nations in the world wanting to talk to other newly independent nations and the older nations too. So what language are they going to use? Well, the vast majority of them chose English, not without some considerable disquiet often and controversy. And you can imagine the reason why if we do a thought experiment and I ask you to imagine yourself as being in charge of one of these newly independent nations in the 1960s and 70s, be in charge in Ghana or Nigeria, for instance. What will you do linguistically once you've chosen your new flag and everything? Well, an awful lot of countries said we will use a local language, an indigenous language, and get away from the language of imperialism, distance ourselves from the past. But you have a problem in Nigeria and many other countries because you have so many languages to choose from. Over 400 languages spoken in that amazing country. And which will you choose? If you choose that one, they will not like it. If you choose that one, they will not like it, and so on. So in the end, almost everywhere decided, as it were, to go to the old idiom, better the devil you know. At least everybody hates English equally, as it were. And so they chose English. They said, we will continue with English. But then you see, the magic happened. Because country after country said, yes, we will adopt English, but we will make it ours. We will adapt it. We will make it Nigerian. We will make it Ghanaian. We will make it Singaporean, and so on. This is exactly what happened. And it didn't take long, you see, as the American experience indicated. Now, I know this because I was there, as it were. I know you can't tell from this youthful expression, but in the 1960s, in 1967 it was, a colleague and I at the University of Reading introduced a project called A Dictionary of English-Speaking Peoples. And what we did was we wrote to all the newly developing countries in the world, I mean to the universities and so on, and said, are you doing anything about developing a new variety of English in your country? Not knowing what the answer was going to be. And they all came back and said, of course we are, yes. And they told us what their projects were. And sometimes sent us lists of new words that were coming into the English language in their country. Words to do with plants and animals, as I mentioned before, the myths and legends of the country, the food and drink of the country, the politics of the country, the folklore of the country, and so on. Everything that makes up the culture of a community was manifesting itself into the vocabulary and the idiom of these newly developing nations. So these nations have now, you see, since the 60s and 70s had, well, 50 years of development, and that's a huge amount of time to develop your local variety into something that is different from every other English variety in the world. It isn't just the academics that are doing this, or the people on the street, as it were. No, it's becoming institutionalized. What do I mean by that? Institutions are taking it up, have taken it up. The newspapers, the television, the radio, the internet, of course, the literature of the country. So many countries around the world now have an indigenous literature in English. And when that happens, of course, you see the identity of that country clearly manifested in a novel, for instance. You see the characters no longer using an old-style British standard English, but now enthusiastically, happily, confidently speaking on the page in the local English of their area, and often very many varieties of English there as well, you know, especially when there's a community background which has a Creole English there or a Pidgin English there. That is on the page also. So this is what I mean by institutionalization. The local variety of English, which at one time might have been called, dismissed as a gutter English, as an inferior kind of English. Now, so many countries now have got through that immature stage and are now proud of the local English that is in their country, and quite rightly so. And proud in all areas, in vocabulary, in grammar, in pronunciation, in orthography, in the discourse strategies that they use to each other. And that pride is perhaps most noticeable in the notion of a regional accent. I've lost track of how many people over the years have said to me and to everybody in the IATEFL world, oh, I want to sound like a native speaker of English. I'm ashamed of my accent. I wish my accent was better. And they are speaking perfectly intelligible English, indeed very fluent English, in a lovely local accent which tells me where they are from. And I value these accents. And I always say to them, why do you want to lose your lovely accent? I don't want to lose mine. I don't speak RP. You see pronunciation? No, I don't speak RP, do I? No, 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 no. No, I speak this kind of strange amalgam of Northern English and Welsh English and all the things that are part of me, and a little bit of RP in there as well, because I've moved around and become an academic, and so I've got a mixed accent. Mixed accent. Missed accent. No, no, no. Accent. I say O. I don't say O. I say example or example. Which is it? I never know. Sometimes I say example. Sometimes I say example. I don't know which is going to come out next, because my accent is a mix of all the background that has made me what I am linguistically. And it is the same for you. Your background, whatever it is going to manifest itself in an accent that tells people who you are and where you're from. And that should be a matter of pride, and should not be felt necessary to change it in the direction of some other alien part of the world. I mean, of course, if you want to, it's up to you. If you want to sound like a native speaker, by all means, it's a free world. Well, very large. Well, never mind. That's another issue. But, you know, if you are living in a free part of the world, then it's up to you. If you want to change your accent. It's always been the case, but you don't have to. And one certainly shouldn't be penalized for it. So this is all a matter of pride. It's business of local identity. But don't exaggerate it. People sometimes are saying now, oh, English as it's moved around the world has become so diverse that we're soon going to not be able to understand each other. These local variations are going to become greater and greater, and one day English will break up into a family of mutually unintelligible English languages, just like we have the Slavic languages and the Romance languages and so on. Any evidence of this happening? Well, actually, there are one or two cases around the world, very special cases where this has already happened. I'm thinking now of a place like Papua New Guinea, where talk pidgin has developed there, historically out of English, and now is a autonomous language with its own literature and culture, and is unintelligible to me very largely. On the occasions when I've had to deal with it, I've had to learn it, as it were, and it is in effect a different language. And so it can happen, but the vast majority of Englishes around the world are not like that. Indeed, if you quantify the amount of difference in an international variety of English, you don't get a very large figure. Let's do that, in fact. Let's take grammar to begin with. How much grammatical difference is there between the different varieties of English around the world? Well, can't generalize, because so many of these new varieties haven't had a kind of full grammatical description yet. But in those that have, the answer is tiny. 1%, 2%, maybe as much as 5% of the grammar of English is different in that part of the world compared with everywhere else. It's small. I mean, let's take the two main varieties of English that everybody knows about, British English and American English. How many grammatical differences are there between British and American English? After over 200 years of these two varieties evolving in different directions. How much? Well, we know the answer. If you go to a big reference grammar, like the big Quirk grammar, the Quirk, Greenbaum, Leach and Sartvik, the comprehensive grammar of the English language, that thick if you've got it on your shelves, 2.4 kilograms of grammar in there. And you go to the index at the back of the book and look at all the references there are to British English and all the references are to American English. And there are just a few dozen, 2 or 3 dozen. Now, there are something like 3,500 points of grammar in that book. I know, because I wrote the index and I had to go through it point by point and check them all out. So, 20 or 30 points of difference between British and American English out of, 3,000 or so. Not much, is it really? I mean, when they turn up, it's noticeable. If an American says it's a quarter of one instead of it's quarter to one, you notice that. Or if an American says, I just ate, whereas a British person would probably say, I've just eaten. Well, you notice that. So you start collecting all these things, and you get to a couple of dozen and you run out. So not much grammar, really. What about pronunciation? Well, not much there either. When you actually look at all the variations in vowels and consonants, you'll get a few slight differences of vowel quality here and there, things like that, but it doesn't add up to very much. The main difference, of course, is one that still is evolving, and it's in its early stages. And it's difficult to know the long-term consequences of this. The main difference, of course, is nothing to do with vowels and consonants at all, but is all to do with intonation and rhythm. As you know, there are many rhythmical differences in the languages of the world. Two basic types, though there are many others. Stress-timed rhythm, which is the tum-ti-tum, ti-tum, ti-tum rhythm of traditional spoken English. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the heartbeat of traditional English literature. And then you get syllable-timed rhythm, the rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat sort of rhythm that you get if you speak French or something like that. And many languages in the world, something like 3/4 of the languages in the world, have some sort of syllable-timed rhythm in that way. Now, English, in some parts of the world, if it's been in contact with a syllable-timed language, has inevitably evolved a syllable-timed local variety of English. And so you hear this in India, in South Africa, in many countries, in the Caribbean in particular. And I say in particular because that is the variety which has had a lot of international influence. Somebody from the Caribbean, if you say, where are you from? And the person doesn't say, I'm from Jamaica, ti-tum-ti. He says something like, I'm from Jamaica. I'm from Jamaica, man. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And that kind of syllable timing is very characteristic of popular genres like hip hop and rap. Rapping is a hugely diverse kind of medium, but an awful lot of it is syllable timed. And this is what's picked up by youngsters in different parts of the world, and they are impressed by it, and their English suddenly comes to be influenced by it. So if you go down to the East End of London these days and you hear a group of mother tongue speakers of English, born and bred in the East End of London, you will often hear them these days speaking in a syllable timed kind of way. They're not saying things like, me and my mate are going down to the garage tonight. Tum-ti, 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 tum. Me and my mate are going down to the garage tonight. They're saying things like this. Me and my mate, we are going down to the garage tonight. Speaking in a sort of Cockneyish kind of way, but with this me and my mate, you hear the difference? Now that didn't, that's something relatively new in that part of the world, but very widespread now. And other places are beginning to develop it as well. Has it got a long-term future? I don't know, but I suspect it probably has. So if you're in a country where you've been teaching English and you've been spending an awful lot of sweat trying to get English to become a tum-ti-tum-ti-tum language in your students, and they are going rat-tat-tat-tat, well, maybe you don't need to be quite so worried about it as you used to be. So a certain amount of difference in pronunciation, but for the most part, there's not that much difference, is there? And that leaves us with vocabulary. And this, of course, is the area where there is most noticeable variation. Yes, when I was talking to those people back in the 60s and they were sending me information, they were sending word lists. Yes, local word lists about whatever it is that has been adapted in their country. Plants and animals, food and drink, and so on, as I mentioned before. And at the time, the word lists were relatively short. But 30 years on, 50 years on, oof, there are now dictionaries of these local Englishes around the world. A dictionary of South African English, for example, which might have, I've got one on my shelf here, has got over 10,000, 12,000 items in it. I've got a dictionary on my shelf, a huge thing, Dictionary of Trinidad and Tobago English, those little islands in the Caribbean, and there's over 10, 12,000 items in that, just used in those islands alone. Any part of the world you go to now will have evidence of local vocabulary reflecting local culture. And it's something you notice straight away as you go traveling. As I go traveling, as I used to go traveling once upon a time. I remember my travels. Gosh, haven't been abroad for 2 years now. Anyway, at least abroad physically. I'm abroad now, of course, virtually. Yeah, you go into a restaurant in these parts of the world, you say to the waiter, can I have the English menu, please? And he gives you a menu and you look at it and you say, sorry, I wanted the English menu. And he says, that is the English menu. You can't understand it because all the food and drink is local, untranslatable. And that's the sort of thing I mean. The local vocabulary and idiom of that part of the world can now become very noticeable. And not just because of borrowing from the local culture, from the local languages in that culture. That's a very important part, of course. Most of the words in the South African dictionary I mentioned come from languages like Afrikaans and Xhosa and Zulu and so on. But not all. So I'm remembering now the first time I went to South Africa and we were driving down the road, British Council driver, and I see a sign and it says robot ahead. And I turn to him and I say, what's a robot? Have they landed? And he laughs at me. He doesn't understand why I can't understand this everyday term. You don't know what a robot is? No, I don't know what a robot is. Turns out that robot means traffic light. It's the South African word for a traffic light. So people say things in South African English like, the robot is broken, or the robot is red, or turn left at the robot, or I live near that robot, and so on. Now, once you know, you know. But of course, there are several thousand more expressions like that. Now, do you need to know them? Well, if you're going to encounter South Africa in any serious way, yes, you do. And the same point would apply whichever parts of the world you are encountering. So for most people and most students that IATEFLers have to deal with, it's going to be the vocabulary of British English or the vocabulary of American English, maybe some other Englishes as well. And it's always wise to do an inventory check of your students to find out what other parts of the world they're likely to encounter, either by physical travel or by internet travel. That's very important. Once upon a time, the chances of me or you going to a place like South Africa might be remote, but now it's so easy. I just have to go online and there it is in all its glory. And if I'm in a social medium like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or any of these media that are out there these days, who knows who I'll be talking to from another part of the world? In fact, I won't know because most contributors are going to be anonymous. So I'm going to encounter vocabulary and maybe other features from these other parts of the world online in a way that no teacher in the classroom could ever have predicted. And so it's very important, it seems to me, that one builds into one's teaching strategy an awareness of the growing cultural identity of these new varieties of English. That is the big thing, it seems to me, these days, more than ever before, that linguistic studies have to be complemented by cultural studies in a systematic kind of way. Of course, English courses have always had a certain amount of culture in them. So, for instance, you go to a course book And in chapter whatever it is, which is teaching a point of grammar, there'll usually be a little story there which takes you down a London street or to the zoo or into a shop or whatever it is. And that point of grammar is illustrated. And at the back, there'll be some vocabulary there. And some points of culture will be part of that, doubtless. But it's done in a kind of sporadic sort of way, isn't it? Not systematically. And the thing is that these cultural differences are the ones that people are least likely to notice, in the sense that one doesn't notice one's own culture when one is talking. It just spills out. And somebody who encounters that local culture can be confused by the cultural difference that is there. Let me give you an example. Look, I've got my watch here. And I say to you, we're just chatting away, and somebody says, "It's a nice watch you've got, David." And I say, "No, it's not Bond Street, you know." And carry on talking. Now, what does that mean? What did it mean when I said it's not Bond Street, you know? Well, if you know the culture of British English, if you know the culture of London, if you know that Bond Street is the most expensive street in London, then you know that what I'm saying to you is it's a cheap watch. It's not actually a very expensive watch at all. If you know that, there's no problem. If you don't know that, there's a problem. You haven't understood the sentence. You've understood the grammar, you've understood the vocabulary, you've understood the pronunciation, but you haven't understood the sentence at all. But you're too polite to intervene and say, "Sorry, excuse me, stop this conversation for a moment. What is Bond Street, please?" We don't do that. We just assume that, it's an issue, it'll pass by. I mean, it's not important really. If it is, it'll emerge in the later conversation. We don't interrupt people and ask about culture. They might think we're being rude. It slows the conversation down, so we let it pass. Now, how much of that kind of cultural difference is there? And it cuts both ways, you see. I now come to your part of the world. I come to Poland. And we're having a conversation in English at an IATEFL meeting. And we're all speaking English very, very happily together. And we're now talking about something about that's happening in Poland at the moment. And you start talking enthusiastically about whatever it is, you know, a political change, a cultural change, a new traffic problem in the center of the city. And suddenly I've lost you. Because I don't understand the cultural allusions. And I'm too polite to say, "Sorry, would you explain everything you just said to me?" I mean, what is the cultural equivalent of this watch in Warsaw? If you're speaking in English and you say, "Now, this watch, it's not like such and such a street in Warsaw," or whatever other city you're living in, and you drop it into the conversation, and I have no idea what you mean because I don't know what that street is. You see the problem? And so this is one of the major implications, it seems to me, when you come to adapting what I've been saying to the teaching and learning of English. I think there are three big implications. One is to try to introduce systematically into one's courses something about the cultural background. If a point of culture comes up, then don't just let it pass, explore it a little bit. So if in one of the dialogues in a course book, somebody goes down Bond Street, shall we say, or Oxford Street, then let it be discussed that what these streets are in terms of their cultural importance in London, and then contrast them perhaps with another area of the city where the shops would be dealing with less expensive items. So one is getting a sense of the system of the economy of the country through these examples. A little bit of more systematic background in cultural awareness. Right from the very beginning, by the way. I'm not saying that any of this is for an advanced level of teaching. This is a fallacy. People sometimes say, "Oh, I'll teach them English first, and then I'll teach them the cultural stuff later at an advanced level." No, no, no. Bring it in right at the very beginning. Lesson 1, year 1. chapter 1 in a book. We're talking about a car. All right, well, if you're teaching British English, you'll be talking to them about bonnets and boots in the motor car. Well, if you're teaching American English, you'll be teaching them about hoods and trunks in the motor car, in the automobile. Yes, well, why not both? Why not say, yes, you're learning British English, and so you need to know, but this is a bonnet and that is a trunk, that is a boot. But bear in mind that if you're going to go to America or anything, the words are going to be different, so teach them both. In any case, they're going to encounter these words out of the classroom. So why not anticipate it? They're going to go online. They're going to watch American television and films and everything like that. So they're going to encounter these words. So get them prepared. Just drip, drip, drip. Not too much. Just build it into the course, it seems to me. It's very sensible. So point 1, cultural awareness. Point 2, pride. Make sure that they are proud of the local way they speak. And I'm not just talking now about British English and American English and Australian English. I'm talking about Polish English and French English and Greek English and so on. By Polish English, I do not mean the mistakes one might make when one is learning the language because of interference from Polish. No, I am talking about the kind of interference, the kind of adaptation. You say, I don't want to use the word interference at all. I want to talk about the adaptations that you make when you are speaking Polish English fluently. And then thirdly, to bear in mind the difference between comprehension and production. Because I'm not suggesting for one moment that everybody learns to speak in these new varieties of English or to write in these new varieties of English. No. People will speak and write in the variety that they're being taught. So if you're being taught British English and receive pronunciation, fine. That's fine. That will be your métier for speaking English. If you're doing general American and with an American accent and American dialect and so on, fine. Yeah. But in terms of listening comprehension and reading comprehension, then everything changes, it seems to me, if you're going to encounter and assimilate global English well. Yes, one learns in production one kind of English, but in listening and reading comprehension, one tries to become experienced in as many kinds of these global varieties of English as it's practicable to introduce. Now, I'm not a teacher. I don't do your difficult job, but I am an observer. And I've often gone into classrooms and observed. And at IATEFL meetings, I listen to what the teachers tell me. And many teachers now introduce this listening and reading experience right from the very beginning of the teaching program in English. In other words, lesson 1, once again, they have been teaching the students a particular set of phrases or sentences or structures or vocabulary in an English accent, and that's the one they're learning. But why not expose them to that particular sentence? This is a table or whatever it is that they're being taught in a number of different accents, so that they are getting used to listening to the language in all its variety. Once upon a time, quite difficult to do, maybe, to get source material on this. Not so difficult these days, when we have resources like IDEA, I-D-E-A, the International Dialects of English Archive in the United States, which has hundreds of accents now available at the press of a button. So all of this, I hope, will produce a practical appreciation of the evolving nature of English as a global language. And the future of English is then, perhaps for your students, will not be quite as off-putting a phenomenon and off-putting a notion as they might have felt it to be. So thank you for that. Thank you very much. Hope you all been listening and not fallen asleep. How do I know? You might all be fast asleep now. But if you're not, then perhaps there's time for a few questions and things before you go on to the next part of your excellent conference. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll express the sentiments of everybody present here if I say thank you, Professor, for a really interesting talk on the growing importance of cultural elements in our everyday teaching practice, I guess. Thank you again. Well, we might still have some questions, so let's see. Well, maybe I'll just read one of the questions. Many people wonder whether Brexit will affect the status of the English language as the lingua franca of Europe. How do you see this?
Yeah, it's a question that's been asked quite a lot over the last couple of years. Me, I don't think it'll affect it at all. It all depends, of course, on how Europe decides to place itself in relation to the rest of the world. If Europe wants to continue an outward-looking development and introduce trade and political relationships and so on with other parts of the world, then it has got to carry on using English in the way in which it is at the moment, because that's what everybody else is doing, and they will have no alternative. If, on the other hand, there is some kind of internal closing up of the European community, then indeed other languages could become more important and eventually replace English internally. But that would be a very strange development, it seems to me. But that's a question more for politicians than for mere linguists. At the moment, I don't see much change. Of course, there is a change in the internal structure of the community, and the number of interpreters and translators and so on is altering. But bear in mind, of course, that English is still there in the EU with Ireland and Malta. And a number of countries have now invested so strongly in English that they would not look kindly on any move to try to introduce another language to replace it. It could happen, but I don't see much sign of this at the moment. Last time I was in Luxembourg, some time ago now, of course, there was a lot of discussion of this, and the general mood was, amongst the translators and interpreters there, that the big issues of the next few years are not going to be in relation to English as such, but in relation to the kind of English that they would need to translate and interpret into. The sort of thing they were thinking of, you see, was precisely what I've been talking about. If I'm translating somebody from a minister from France, shall we say, or from Germany or wherever, do I translate into a neutral, culturally neutral kind of English, or do I reflect in my translation the cultural background of that speaker? If the speaker uses a kind of local expression that is local to France or local to Germany, do I maintain it? Do I present it, even though it might not be intelligible to some other countries, or do I translate it into something more neutral that everybody will understand? There was a lot of controversy about this. And different ministers have different views about it, you see. One minister will say, I want my exact words to be translated, and another will say, no, put it into something more general. So it's these issues of variety that I think are attracting more interest at the moment, rather than the broader question, which isn't really controversial at all for most of them, I think whether English will continue as an important lingua franca there.
Well, we have one more question. To what extent does local cultural context change with the growing importance of new technology? What's your view?
There hasn't so far been very much change. Now that might strike you as an odd response, because obviously there have been so many new platforms out there which have got new styles of English on them. So you look at Facebook and TikTok and WhatsApp and Twitter and all of these, and indeed there are new styles of English there, as there are in your languages also. But when you actually analyze the language that is out there and say, just how much change has there been in grammar and vocabulary and so on? Well, the answer is the same as the one I gave in my talk. Less than 5%. Go looking, count all the new words that have come into English as a result of the internet. I did this a few years ago for another book called A Glossary of Text Speak and Net Speak. And I found, a few thousand new expressions, a couple of thousand new expressions, but that's a drop in the ocean of English vocabulary, isn't it? It's only a tiny amount. Next to no change in grammar. In orthography, in things like punctuation and capitalization and spelling, yes, a little bit more difference there, but even then, not that much. So the English language, if you compare it now with what was there pre-1990, I'm taking that as my period because the World Wide Web started in 1991. Compare the English before the internet with the English after the internet, you won't find that much change. And so once again, I say, the core English language survives as an entity. Standard English exists around the world with British tinges here and there and American tinges here and there and so on. But the vast majority of the language is exactly the same and seems to be resistant to these cultural and technological innovations. And it's likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future.
So the next question. So do you suggest that teaching pronunciation is futile?
Oh, on the contrary, because remember what I said in the talk, that the pronunciation has to be intelligible. So there are two forces that drive language, the need for intelligibility and the need for identity. These are the two big things. Intelligibility is what motivates the learning of standard English grammar, standard English vocabulary, and a variety of pronunciation that everybody will understand. And that is why received pronunciation developed in English as first of all, a national and then an international accent that is likely to achieve the greatest amount of understanding. That is why the BBC chose it as an accent when it first evolved. And that's why in America we have a general American kind of accent as well. So that's important. Yes, one has to achieve that stage of national or international acceptability. So absolutely not futile. Yes, you've got to get students to that stage, but how much of pronunciation is in that intelligibility? A difficult question to answer, but I would guess and say something like 80% or so, maybe 90% of all the accents in the world are exactly the same. But that remaining 10% or 20%, whatever it is, that's where identity is being expressed. It's not going to interfere with intelligibility because that is already there. You have taught that. But don't be too worried about getting rid of that remaining 10 or 20%, you see. That's my point. Be proud of that 10 or 20%, whatever it is, so that the accent that we actually hear, when I go to IATEFL and I hear accents from all over the world, and it's like entering a garden of flowers where there is so many different kinds of flower. What a bore it would be if I went into a garden and there was only one kind of flower. When I go to an IATEFL meeting, I want to see hear as many kinds of flowers as there are regional accents, and that's part of the gorgeousness of any language, but of English in particular.
I guess we might still have time for the last question. Do different Englishes influence British English?
Yes, they always have. Languages have always influenced British English generally. Think of all the vocabulary you've learned and the languages where that vocabulary came from. There are over 350 languages that have loaned words into English over the centuries. English is an amalgam, a vacuum cleaner of languages. And so this has always happened. And when English became a global language, same thing carried on. So varieties influence each other depending upon cultural power and economic power. And so the obvious thing is American English influencing British English. Yes, indeed. Over the last 100 years or so, we've seen an increasing amount of American English influencing British in all areas: grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. In pronunciation, I say the word schedule, meaning times of things, like I just said it. All my children, all 4 of them, say schedule. So, because of American English. So when I'm talking to my kids, I say schedule as well. Actually, it's another example of sometimes I say the one and sometimes I say the other. In orthography, we see it as well. The Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English language that I mentioned. How do you spell encyclopedia? Traditionally, it would have had an A-E in the middle. But no, it has an E in the middle, the American way. And that's in Cambridge University Press, the oldest press in the English-speaking world, you know. So yes, there are these influences going in British in that direction. Other varieties of English, not so much. Just occasionally, we'll get Australian English, South African English, and so on. I've already mentioned Caribbean English having an influence, but in a much smaller way than American English. But yes, it happens.
I guess no further questions. So, Professor, thank you very much again, and we hope to see you at our next conference next year.
Oh, wouldn't that be lovely? Really in the life and drinking together and all the rest of it. But no, not for the moment. And I wish you all well for this conference. Hope the next couple of days go extremely well. I'm sure they will. And as we say now, whenever we're leaving anybody around the world, the new farewell is stay safe.
Stay safe, Professor. Bye.
Bye-bye.